yes, we'll open it up to questions.
Okay, the question is somebody is asking about different forms of sugar like xylitol and sucrose in, any, is the brand is important, and also how do they affect different sugars? How do they affect the recipe and the viscosity in grinding?
Really? Just one second. Can you check it's running low back?
Hello? Okay.
Just give me 1 second. We're having some technical issues right here. Right. So about the sugars, it is it's a very important how you manage your sugar gradient. There's a lot of sugars that you can use. The most popular one, of course, is sucrose, which is table sugar. Sucrose is what we call 1, which is the standard for sweetness. And every other sugar will be either sweeter or less sweet than sugar. So dextrose, of course, is about 65% as sweet as sugar. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt this just 1 second. We're experiencing some technical difficulty. I'll be right back. What's happening? Jolly, please. Good. Oh, it's here. It's this thing. Should we get him to fix this up, please? Stop. Sorry, we've seemed to our connection seems to have fallen off, and my computer is threatening to die on me. So that was just a quick panic right there. Sorry about that, everyone. So yes, sugars. So it's a very, very important concept. And if you would like my personal chart for sugar sweetness levels, of course, reach out to me and I'll send that across to you. Outside of the sweetness of sugar, different sugars also add different properties to your nut base. Glucose is great if you want sugar that is decrystallizing. Sorbitol, which we added in our caramel, is great because sorbitol locks in a lot of water. Good, got it. Sorbitol locks in a lot of water, which increases the shelf life of your product. So if you want to increase the shelf life by making sure that the activity of water is lowered, sorbitol is great for that. Dextrose, of course, has the same properties as sucrose, but with a much lower sugar. You can add sugars to flavor your things, such as honey, but honey is sweeter than sugar. So that's a whole different course, and I could speak for hours on sugar. So if you have sugar-related questions, I'd be happy to answer them in email.
Next question is, they're asking about using cocoa nibs instead of the chocolate powder, and then we have to melt the chocolate powder. Also in the marshmallow recipe, is that the chocolate powder, or do you melt the chocolate?
Right. So no, you cannot use cocoa nibs instead of cocoa powder. Cocoa nibs are if you conch down cocoa nibs, you'll get chocolate, which is about 45% cocoa and 55% cocoa butter. So you're adding a lot more fat to your recipe if you're using cocoa nibs. So no, you cannot use cocoa nibs instead of cocoa powder. And in the marshmallow recipe, it's chocolate. It's not cocoa powder. It's chocolate. It's milk chocolate and dark chocolate.
The other one they're asking is, the tempering. Can you talk a little bit about tempering? Do we have to temper the nut butters?
So if you're adding cocoa butter to your nut butter, yes. If you're not adding cocoa butter, no. So what you're tempering in the recipe is any solid fat. So if you're adding a solid fat such as cocoa butter, then you must temper it. But for example, in the artisanal peanut butter recipe, there's no cocoa butter, there's no chocolate, so you don't need to temper it. In the Praline recipe, where we caramelize the sugar, we didn't add any chocolate, we didn't add any cocoa butter. That doesn't need tempering. You just need to cool it down and pour. As soon as you add any chocolate or any cocoa butter, yes, you need to temper it. Is there any more questions?
Okay, what temperature do you start filling the jars? And then how do you increase the shelf life?
Right. So the temperature that I fill the jars are usually at room temperature. You can do it hotter as well, as long as there's no cocoa butter in there. The only one where it's very, very important that you're using the right temperature is if it's tempered. If it's not tempered, as long as it's room temperature, it's good. You could even fill it right out of the conch. And I'm sorry, what was the second question, please?
How do you increase the shelf life of the nut butters?
Right. How do you increase the shelf life? Of course, lecithin plays an important role in making sure it stays emulsified. The adding a little bit more sugar helps you with the shelf life. Nut butters are usually already pretty long in shelf life, as long as you seal it properly. You seal it airtight to make sure that it's not exposed to more oxygen than it has to be exposed to. But if you're still worried about it, you can explore antioxidizing additives such as vitamin E, vitamin C. Those are some additives that you can add in artisanal productions, in chef-led productions. Usually lecithin and beeswax are the only acceptable additives. Outside of that, it becomes sort of more commercial. So I wouldn't recommend going into that sort of additive. With just the recipes that I've given you, you'll get a good 6 months to a year shelf life, which should be, I mean, for all intents and purposes, should be a good enough time to sell a fresh cocoa or sell a fresh nut butter. Another thing to be conscious about with artisanal production is shelf life versus when you're eating it. So something can be good for a year, but do you really want to eat something that's been sitting on a shelf for 8 months? No. So for me, it's more important that my shelf life is good enough so that we can sell it to retailers and things like that, but it is consumed as fresh as possible.
Do you have any nut butters that you made you want to show, or anything like in action?
Oh, we don't currently. We actually had to shut down the kitchen to do this course. But yeah, no, I'd love to. If anybody would like to see some of our nut butters, I'd love to send you guys some pictures and emails.
Can I ask a question?
Sorry about. Yes, please.
Yes, when the paste comes out of the melanger, in order to make a cocoa bar, it is still liquid. How come the cocoa bar becomes crispy and you can break it and hear the pop sound? What solidifies the liquid, the liquor? Is it some additives that you add to it, or what makes it?
It's a cocoa butter. It's just tempering the cocoa butter. You have to temper your cocoa butter correctly, and it will set in a way that has a good snap. And of course, if you're making a Duja, same thing. You're using cocoa butter, follow the tempering curve for the cocoa butter, and you'll get a good snap. You don't need any additives.
Okay, since we cannot add water inside the melanger when we're grinding the cocoa nibs, is it possible to add oil in the melanger?
Yes, of course. Anything that is non-hydrous, anhydrous, you can add in there. So oil is a very, very common thing to add with when you're making cookie butters, right? Instead of nut butters, when you're making cookie butters with a nut, if you put a nut in there and you grind it, the nut sort of has enough oil already. But if you're using like a speculoos or you know, like a dark chocolate cookie butter, it usually will not have enough of its own oil. So you add some more oil in there. And I think even in the Nutella recipe that I've given you, there is some added oil. Let's see. Yeah. So there's some added canola oil in there. So of course, it depends on what recipe you're using. And if you want it to be slightly more fluid, the more oil you add, the more fluid it becomes.
Great.
Okay.
One last.
One second. Sorry to interrupt, sir.
Okay, ma'am.
When you ask questions, please go ahead and put it in the chat. The reason is, if it's in the chat, we will also send all the answers as you know, my blog or something, so it will benefit everybody. Because there are a lot of people who signed up, but they don't speak English as their native language. So when we put it in writing, it will help them. So we ask questions live, but also put the same questions in the chat if you can.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
One final question, then I put it in the chat. Is it? I intend to use my cocoa liquor as a paste, a glazer actually, as a glaze on my donuts. Is it possible that? No. I'm wondering if it's not going to keep running off the donuts just because it's liquid. It's all liquid, and you glaze your donuts with it and leave it on the shelf, and it runs off the donuts onto the plate. What do you think is going to keep it sticky on the donuts? Because if
so you cannot actually. So you're using the wrong thing to glaze your donuts. So you're using the wrong product to glaze your donuts. The correct product to use to glaze donut is something called a pâte glacée, which uses the cocoa liqueur as one of the ingredients. You use cocoa liqueur, you use oil, usually some cocoa liqueur, oil, a lot of icing sugar goes into pâte glacée. So if you Google pâte glacée, you'll get a lot of recipes for that.
Okay, but not at all the cocoa that comes out of the melanger, right?
No.
Not the paste. Okay.
No. Mr. Balu, do we have any more questions?
Yes, we have more questions. I'm just trying to go through that in order. Okay, somebody is asking about tempering machine. Can you use this, spreads through the kind of tempering machines with the screw pump or wheel temper?
So, do you mean something like this? You see my tempering machine right there? So on something like this, I would only use nut butter in there if it is very, very fluid. So I would recommend no. I would say no, do not use it in your tempering machine for a lot of reasons, but mostly because once you put it in your tempering machine, then you have added nuts to your tempering machine. No matter how much you clean your tempering machine, that there is going to be traces of nuts in there. So you can no longer sell your chocolate, what the tempering machine was made for. You cannot sell it as a nut-free product, which is very limiting in the market because nut allergies are very, 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 very important allergies to be conscious of. So I would say don't do it. One, it's not the best thing. It's not made for that. It's very easy to temper your nut butters without a tempering machine, even if you have cocoa butter in there. A great product is something called Easy Temper. It is a machine that stabilizes your cocoa butter. You just put some cocoa butter in there, leave it for a couple hours. It creates something called cocoa butter silk. And you could just put 1% of that cocoa butter silk in your nut paste and just mix it. Boom, you have your thing tempered, it's ready. So there's a lot of other solutions to that. You do not need to put it in your tempering machine. And don't worry about that solution, about the the Easy Temper solution. It is in your notes here. And if you would like to know the exact the brand of the cocoa silk machine that I use, I'd be happy to share that with you on email as well.
Okay, can you add vitamins like vitamin E and C?
Those are antioxidants. They're food additives. Usually you don't add them for artisanal purposes. You can, yeah, you can, but I would recommend don't do it.
Okay. And then somebody is asking, do you have a recipe for a peanut butter chocolate, like the peanut butter cups?
Yes, I do. I do. Email me. I do have a really good recipe. I have, it's not my recipe, it's another chef's recipe, but it's a fantastic recipe, and I'm sure both he and I are happy to share it with you.
Okay, good. And then somebody is asking, which nut butter is best for chocolate filling?
It really depends on you and your client. For me personally, I think it depends on, so if you're in Europe, of course, hazelnut is going to be the one that sells the most. If you're in America, peanut is the one that's going to sell the most. Flavor-wise, personally, for me, pistachio is my favorite when it comes to filling chocolate. It's not so much what nut butter you're using to fill chocolate. I think it is important. And as a chocolatier, to me, it's very important that you're using the right chocolate with the right nut butter, right? So you're using the right couverture with the right nut butter.
Okay, the other one is this important question, right? They're asking, how do you recognize or screen for defective or moldy nuts? Like for example, peanuts. You eat, and then finally, the final peanut is always one that's rancid or that doesn't taste right. But when you're making nut butters, how do you screen them?
Right. So it's very so. If you are the owner, if you are the or if you're the stock manager for your production, it is very important that you work with your stock manager to make sure that you are getting your nuts from a very reliable, very trusted source. That is very, very important. The second step is visually checking. So visually, no matter how, you can get it from God himself, and there will always be three or four defective peanuts in there. So visually, those defective peanuts will scream out. They'll be darker, or they'll have like spots on them. You're welcome, just pick them out, throw them away. And then, of course, when you're roasting, I know the recipe says 35 degrees. So before you're roasting them, you're always tasting your peanut, making sure that they're okay. 1 or 2 from each batch, 1 or 2 from each tray. And as you're roasting, I know the recipe says 35 minutes. After 35 minutes, you're taking it out, blowing on it, tasting it. If it needs 10 more minutes, you put it back in there. So as you're tasting it, you'll notice if a whole batch is bad, you'll notice as you're tasting it, throw that batch away, start over. Figuring out thankfully, figuring out if a nut is rancid is very, very easy because they take on a very, very bitter flavor. So one, taking out a couple bad peanuts, just visually is great. If your peanuts have gone rancid, you have to throw away the entire batch.
Did we have anything like a cut test? Like for example, in cocoa, you take the 50 beans and cut it and see if it's underdeveloped, is any defect in the cocoa beans. Do they have any kind of the test for the nuts so people know before they buy what they are buying?
So that would be something that your nut supplier usually does. So that's, since I think whoever asked that question is coming from a bean to bar chocolate background where you have control over the bean itself. You have control over the agricultural process of the bean. Here, it's a little more control. The most of the control that you're using is in the production process, not so much in the agricultural process. So instead of refining the agricultural process, I would say refine your sourcing of the correct bean that you want or the correct nut that you want.
Okay, there are some more questions on the tempering. I want to know, do you just temper the chocolate and add it to the nut paste, or you add the chocolate to the nut paste and then temper the whole mixture?
You can do it either way. Just make sure that if you're adding a tempered chocolate to your nut paste, that it's cool enough that it doesn't detemper your chocolate. I personally like to temper it together. So I will add the chocolate at 45 degrees where it's completely decrystallized, and then I'll temper it together. But you can do it either way.
Okay. They're asking, can they use the cocoa liquor from the melanger as a glaze for dinners?
No.
Okay. And then somebody makes the peanut spread with cacao nibs and sugar, but the result is sticky in the mouth. Do I have to add oil or cocoa butter?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Okay, when I make peanut spread with cacao nibs and sugar, the result is sticky in the mouth. There's a sticky mouth feel when they add that. So how do they make it not sticking to your mouth? Do you add oil or cocoa butter?
So peanut butter is naturally sticky in the mouth. I mean, that's one of the defining features of peanut butter. So if you're getting something that's very sticky, I would say you're doing it right. Now, doing it right is different from getting the correct result that you want. If you want it to be less sticky in the mouth, first thing I want to clarify, what you are getting is the right product. You're doing nothing wrong. Peanut butter is sticky. Now, a way to change that so that what you are getting is something that you want, a more spreadable, less sticky paste, my solution to that would be cocoa butter. Cocoa butter gives it a hardness. So if you add oil to that, it'll just become more fluid. It won't be spreadable. It'll just be more liquidy. I would say go the other way, make it slightly harder, add some cocoa butter. I would say try two solutions. One is cocoa butter, one is beeswax. Try beeswax, that might give you some structural integrity. Try cocoa butter, that might give you some structural integrity. So yeah, you're right. You're right in the way that the way to fix this is playing with the fat. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. Play with the fat, see if oil is the right way, if harder is the right way, if softer is the right way. That'll just be something you have to play around with.
The other question is, in your recipe, do you always use powdered ingredients except for lecithin? Or I know one canola oil you told, but other than that, most of the ingredients, do they have to be powdered ingredient or can it be liquid? Or anything that, any ingredient, if you put in a wrong state, does it affect the result in the end?
As long as it's anhydrous, it doesn't matter. So as long as there's no water in it, it doesn't matter. So glucose, for example, you cannot use glucose syrup because glucose syrup is water-based. Oil, you can use rose oil. You cannot use rose flavoring. Rose flavoring is water-based. But you can use rose oil because it's fat-based. So you can use any fat-based product. It doesn't matter if it's powder or liquid or whatever. As long as it's a fat-based product, you can add it to it. You cannot add any water.
Okay.
So that's also, I'm sorry if I may just interrupt. That's also the reason that we don't use fresh raspberries in the peanut butter and jelly, or fresh fruits in the peanut butter and jelly, because they add a lot of water, which you don't want to add.
Okay. Yeah, somebody is asking for nut suppliers, online suppliers.
That would depend on where you are. Yeah. So if you could tell me where you're from, maybe I'll know somebody. If not, I think that would depend on where you are.
Okay, somebody is asking, do you need to remove the the red skin from the peanut, or can you grind it with the skin?
You can do it both ways. I think customers expect you to remove it. It's called dehulling. You have to winnow it off. The way that I like to do it is for peanuts, I will buy it with the skin. I will roast it in the skin, and then I will winnow off the skin, or I will remove the skin or rub it off after it's been roasted. For pistachios, I will buy skinned pistachios, and then I will roast skinned pistachios, because pistachios, the skin will really affect the color. So with the peanuts, 90% of your skin is going to come off, 10% is fine in there. For pistachio, I want all the skin to be off, so I will have it commercially removed. I will buy skinned green peanuts. Skinned green pistachio. For peanuts and for hazelnuts, I will skin them myself after they've been roasted.
Okay, you mentioned using honey. How and when is this added, and can it fully replace sugar? Like you can substitute it completely for sugar.
So honey, again, if you're adding honey, you have to add freeze-dried honey. You cannot add honey like liquid honey, because again, there's water in liquid honey. You cannot add it. I mean, you can. You're welcome to add it. It will just vastly decrease your shelf life because your emulsion more than shelf life. I would say the one time that I have seen it done well is honey in streaks in your nut butter. So make a marbled honey streaked nut butter. And yes, of course, it can replace it completely.
The hazelnut choco spread, does it have to be tempered? And then can they substitute hazelnut with the peanut?
Yes and yes, both of those. Yes and yes. I've personally made it with peanuts before, and it's fantastic with peanuts. And yes, you have to temper it.
Yes.
So we made this really awesome spread where we've taken this recipe and we've used peanuts, and we filled half the jar with that, and we filled half the jar with salted caramel. It was like a caramel peanut chocolate spread. It was fantastic. It went over fantastically with our clients.
Yeah, somebody said honey clumps in their peanut butter, so that we already explained because of the water. So,
right.
Does anybody else have any other questions? Anybody else have any other questions?
I'm sorry, I asked about the honey. I didn't hear the proper word. Did you say powdered honey?
Yeah, powdered honey, freeze-dried honey would be the best. It's where are you from, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm in Virginia, USA.
Virginia, yeah. Then the product will be freeze-dried honey. If you're from Europe, in Europe you'll usually say Lyo, L-Y-O honey. But yeah, a lot of people would I know I can think of a couple of brands already, but it should be a pretty easily available thing to get freeze-dried honey.
I'm sorry, if you don't mind if I ask you without writing the question, I did request if there is a possibility that you can just briefly or like quickly give us an idea how to prepare the chocolate using the melanger with using the chocolate nibs, if that's okay.
Using the what again? I'm sorry.
Chocolate nibs, from the chocolate nibs, using the melanger.
The cocoa nibs, using the melanger, of course. So that I would say, I'm happy to give you a quick brief on it, but I know that that Mrs. Balu and CocoaTown run a lot of bean to bar chocolate workshops. That would probably give you a much better understanding of how to use cocoa nibs to get a cocoa mass. But the process is the same. You're taking your cocoa nibs, you're roasting them if they're not roasted already, and then you're taking them. So cocoa nibs are usually around 0.3 to 4 millimeters large, which means they're about 100 times as big as you need them to be, or 200 times as big as you need them to be. So you're going to take your cocoa nibs, you're going to put them in your RoboCoupe or your Vitamix or whatever. You're going to grind them till the oil's released, till the cocoa butter is released. If you're going to use it for a spread and not for chocolate, if you're going to use it for a spread, you can even add 5% oil in there so that it makes it easier to process. Of course, if you're using it for chocolate, don't do that. And yeah, one important thing with, then you throw it in your melanger and you make the cocoa liquor. one important difference, one important technicality is because cocoa butter, which is the fat in there, is in the cocoa nibs, is solid and not liquid, like the fats in nuts. You'll need to keep your melanger pretty warm. So you'll need to keep heating the melanger with a heat gun so that it stays about around 40 to 45 degrees so that your cocoa butter stays liquid. But otherwise, the process is about the same.
So, so once you get to this point, so the liquid or the liquor is ready to be poured and tempered, and then poured into molds, correct? Or if you want to add anything to it, like milk powder or sugar, you mix it all together and then you can temper it and then pour it into molds.
No, so you would add anything that you add, you would add at the start of the melanger process. You won't add it at the end.
You add it at the beginning.
At the beginning, right? So you will start by making your liquor. So as soon as you'll give it, I usually give it about half an hour. So it's the same process as your Nutella. You'll mix up all your sugars, your milk, your emulsifiers, a little vanilla usually, and I'll scoop it like a little at a time until the emulsion forms. And I'll do that over the first about 6 hours. I'll keep adding a little at a time in the first 6 hours of my melanger being on. And then I give it about 2 to 3 days.
2 to 3 days in the melanger.
Yeah.
Running in the melanger.
Yes. And then you keep tightening the melanger every 6 to 8 hours until it's down to the lowest setting, and then you keep doing it. Of course, that's great. You can use that for all your nut paste. You can use that for all your other applications. If you're doing bean to bar chocolate, usually, and you'll see a lot of people, putting your cocoa nibs in the melanger, making the bean to bar chocolate, and tempering it and selling it. I can name at least 100 bean to bar chocolatiers that do that. I think, and in the industry, it's usually seen as a low quality chocolate to do that in terms of production, in terms of processing vigor. If you are very, very serious about doing bean to bar production, and I'm sure Mrs. Balu can help you out with that, it is essential that you also buy a refiner, which is something that you put your chocolate through after it's melanged. You'll remove it, and instead of tempering it, you put it through a refiner, and that makes sure that it gets it gets the micron size even smaller, so you get a super clean, super consistent chocolate.
Thank you. I don't know if someone else would like to ask any other question.
There are some questions.
Okay.
Okay. In making peanut butter, what is the best oil to use?
Peanut oil. Cold pressed peanut oil. If you're making peanut butter, use peanut oil. If you're making almond butter, use almond oil.
So any other questions on the nut butters? Because I see some questions on the chocolate liquor, cocoa liquor. I think there is a 2-hour webinar, and people can send us an email and we can share that webinar that they can watch. It is step by step, it gives the detail, because that itself is a separate 3-day workshop we give. So it's not like we can finish in 3 minutes, unfortunately. So
That's a very complicated process by itself.
Okay. So since this topic is nut butter, we request all the people to ask questions on the nut butters, because that's the focus of today's webinar.
Well, if there's no question.
I have a question, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just ask one quick question.
Can you all please type in, please, if you don't mind?
I did. I typed it. It's in. But I just want, that's the next question, I believe. He said we need to keep the melanger running for at 45 degrees for 48 hours to keep the cocoa liquor from solidifying.
See, since it was a chocolate related question, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So as Balu said, you'll probably get a lot more information on that process in the chocolate bean to bar webinar, which I'm sure Mrs. Balu is happy to send to you if you reach out to her. I'm not an expert on bean to bar, but just to sort of briefly answer your question, and I might be wrong. As I said, I'm not an expert in bean to bar, but to the best of my knowledge, you have to keep it warm so that, because the way that the melanger is working is that there's a pool of liquid, and your microns, your grains are floating in that liquid, and the melanger is squeezing those microns against each other in the liquid pool. So if you don't have enough liquid in there, if you don't have enough liquid oil or liquid fat in there, then your melanger will create too much friction, which will end up breaking, it'll end up clumping, and it'll end up breaking your melanger. So you need enough liquid in there, which chocolate already has. So you don't need to add it in there. So if you're making it for nut butter, yeah, you can add a little bit more oil in there because you're going to add oil eventually anyways. But if you're doing it for chocolate where you cannot add oil, then you have to make sure that the intrinsic cocoa butter in the chocolate stays liquid throughout the conching process, and that's why you keep it hot. But as I said, again, the bean to bar webinar is probably a better resource for you.
Thank you.
Okay, somebody else is asking on peanut butter, can they use any other oil other than the peanut oil?
Yeah, you can use any oil you want. Yeah, you can use any oil. Don't use, I mean, if you're going to use truffle oil, it's going to taste like truffle. If you're going to use olive oil, it's going to taste like olive. So I have tried one of Oprah's favorite things a couple of years ago was chocolate that was made with olive oil in it. I think Oprah and Alan Dukas had come together to create, so they intentionally use an oil that has flavor in it. And it gives it this very rich olivey dark chocolate flavor. It's fantastic. So again, it depends on what you want the flavor to be. If you want it to be a clean peanut flavor, peanut oil is probably best. If you don't have access to peanut oil, then use a oil that has no flavor, like a canola oil or a sunflower oil. But if you want to add flavor through oil, use rose oil. That will give you rose flavor. You can use any oil that you want. It will just impart the flavor that the oil has.
Okay, somebody is asking if they have to use coconut sugar in the hazelnut spread and use a 99% dark spread, how to get less grainier?
I'm sorry, I don't, could you repeat that question, please?
Yeah, if they use coconut sugar in the hazelnut spread and use a 99% dark, how to get it less grainier?
In the Nutella spread, do you mean?
Hazelnut spread.
In the hazelnut spread, yes. Okay, in the hazelnut spread. So your first issue is probably that you're using chocolate. That is, so if you're using, for example, this recipe and you're using chocolate, there's too much cocoa butter is in there that's clumping. I'm also guessing that so the coconut sugar is not the problem. The coconut sugar is not the problem here. The coconut sugar is not what's causing the issues. You can use any sugar that you want. Usually sucrose, which is table sugar, gives you the best emulsification. All other sugars will give you a little bit of graininess, but it's not going to be super noticeable. I would say your problem is probably tempering. Your problem is probably there's too much solid in there. There's too much. There's some issues with your recipe. So I would say recipe and tempering are your main issues. If I would play around with it. If you want to email me your recipe, I'm happy to look at it and see if I might have some insight. But really, I would say, in my experience, coconut sugar is not your problem.
Anybody else have any questions?
I've sent a question, but I don't know if you received it. the recipes that you provided us, if we need to make the recipe in bigger quantities, so basically the quantity that you provided us is for like 1 kilogram, basically, because it says the total is 1,000 grams, so I assume it's 1 kilo. So if we need to make more, like bigger quantity, we multiply the quantities, like everything in grams, multiply it by, for example, if we need to make 30 pounds or 25 pounds, we multiply it by 25 or 30 pounds, I mean by 30, or to get the proper quantity per item?
Yeah, so the reason that everything, and it's a very, very important question actually, the reason that everything is a kilo is just because it helps you see the percentages more clearly. I would never make 1 kilo. One, it's a waste of time. It's too small. Your quantities are usually too small. And the emulsification does not happen with such a small quantity. I would usually do 5 kilos minimum as a batch size, which is about 8 or 9 pounds. Yeah, but you can directly multiply 1:1. So if you want about 1 kilo is about 1.7 pounds, I believe, somewhere around that. So I just use a converter on Google, figure out how many pounds, how many kilos is 30 pounds. I'm guessing it'll be around 17 or 18. And then you can just multiply the quantities by that 18 or 17 number.
Yeah, I noticed that you also use the percentage wise. So which one is more accurate, using the percentage or the grams? And also, once you use the percentage, how do you convert it to the percentage?
So if you want to, so again, if I want to make 10 kilos and I know that my recipe is 97.8% peanuts, then I just multiply that number by 10 kilos. So 10 multiplied by 0.978 will give me how many kilos of peanuts that I need. The reason that I put it in percentages is not for that. I would say the reason that I put it in percentages is so that you can clearly see, just by looking at the recipe, what your product is going to look like. So if you see that so if you see that the hazelnut paste, right? The hazelnut Nutella, you can see that it is 9.4% cocoa, right? Which means it's going to be about 10% of that is about cocoa, which means it's going to be pretty dark. It's going to be pretty cocoa forward. It's 40% sugar, so it's going to be extremely sweet, right? So those are things that you can just get a sense for just looking at the percentages, and that's why I like to put my recipe in percentages. The percentages are not going to change, but your grammage can change depending on the scale of your recipe. So the percentages are just there to give you a sense of what the product is going to be. And usually when I'm changing my recipes around, I'll just change my percentages and I'll let the grammages fix themselves.
So you have to work on both, basically. It's important to work on both.
So it's really just important to work on, when you're in production, the grams are what matters. When you're making the product, the grams are what matters. The percentages are not what's important when you're making the product. The percentages are important is when you're developing the recipe. So once you have your recipe set, the percentages don't matter because you know that this is the recipe that you're going to use. When you're developing the recipe, say you make this recipe and you think it needs more chocolate, it needs more chocolate flavor, then you can increase the amount of cocoa powder in there from 9.4. If you think it needs more salt, then you can increase the percentage of salt, right? So if you increase it from 0.4 to 0.6, you know it's going to be 1.5 times as salty.
So, for example, just if you are making like any nut butter and you want to add salt, let's say 20. I know, like if you want to do like not too much salty, like light salt. How much salt should you put per like kilogram versus if you want to make it like just with salt? Like, you know, sometimes it's with salt, sometimes it's with slight salt. So how can you differentiate how much salt to put in either one?
That's a great question. That's a fantastic question. So I'm just going to repeat that question because I think I want everyone to get that. So what she asked is a very important question, is if you go out and buy peanut butter, it usually has salt in it, but it's not branded as salted peanut butter. If it's branded as salted peanut butter, it usually has a lot more salt than the peanut butter that already has some salt in it. So she's asking about what percentages go into a normal peanut butter that has salt just as seasoning, whereas a peanut butter that's salted that has salt as a flavoring, right? So that, of course, depends on your personal taste, depends on what you want to make. The way that the percentages that I use are for a seasoning where the flavor is not salt, but I'm just getting the salt in there to make the other flavors pop, is between 0.2 to 0.3%. If I want it to be salt flavored, so if I wanted to say salted peanut butter or dark chocolate with salt, then it's between 0.4 to 0.6% salt.
And that's equivalent to what in grams?
So that's about 2 to 3, 0.2% will be 2.2% will be about 2 grams of salt in every kilo, right? Yeah. So about it's about 2 grams of salt in every kilo. If I want to do just as a supporting, just no, that's for
slight salt.
Just light. That's for peanut butter where the salt is a seasoning, not a flavoring.
Right.
If it's a flavoring, I do anywhere between 4 to 6 grams of salt.
4 to 6%?
4 to 6 grams in every kilo, so 0.4 to 0.6%.
4 to 6 grams. Okay, so yeah, I see. Okay, got it.
Okay, please, are you done, please?
I'm sorry?
Are you done?
No, I said, yeah, it's clear. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, because
Thank you. That's a great question. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
and also maybe the people who are talking, they can also tell their names so we know who is asking. And then next one is, instead of using cocoa powder and cocoa butter in the hazelnut choco spread, can they use just the chocolate liquor? The bean to butter?
Yes, of course you can. So this recipe is made to be a copycat for Nutella, and Nutella uses cocoa powder and sugar and cocoa butter. I mean, they don't use cocoa butter. I use it because I don't want to use some of the gums and some of the glycerin that they use. But this is the reason that I use those two different things here is because if you use it's going to not be the same proportion. I also have a Nutella recipe with chocolate, which tastes a little more, which is nicer than Nutella, but it doesn't taste like Nutella. This will taste like Nutella. If you would like the recipe for a real chocolate Nutella, so a real chocolate-based spread, reach out to me. I'm happy to share that recipe with you as well. And
then when the package is, like the product is packaged, what are the care that you should take to, achieve the preserving or increasing the shelf life? For example, using the glass bottles, and then how long does the butter last?
So if you do it commercially, if you do it, you can take as little or as much precaution as you want to take. Heat your glass bottles and cool them down before you put them. Make sure that you're filling it all the way to the top so there's no extra air. If you're in a larger production and you have the ability to do that, use a heat sealing on your individual jars. If you're in an even larger production and you have the ability to do that, we do something called a nitrogen injection, which just before sealing the jar, it'll fill it with nitrogen so that there's no actual air in there. Whatever space there is nitrogen, which is for all intents and purposes inert, so it'll increase your shelf life. But yeah, you can take a lot of different pieces of care. If you're doing it in an artisanal process, I'm just going to say, make sure that your jars are sterilized, make sure you're filling it highly, and make sure you're storing it at the right temperature.
I'm sorry, is the nitrogen method, is it safe for human consumption?
Yep.
It doesn't I mean, it's like it doesn't cause any damage to the human health.
Nope. So most of the commercial chocolates, so when you eat a pack of Lay's, the air that's in there, that's actually usually enriched nitrogen, because air is going to make stuff stale, because it's got oxygen in it. So it's called a flow wrap machine. A lot of the machines that create that. So what they'll do is they'll fill one side, they'll fill the rest with nitrogen, and then they'll fill the other side. And nitrogen is a safe inert gas.
I'm sorry, I have one more question. Regarding the crunchy nut butter, you did mention in the beginning that you do the paste and then and then you add the pieces. Like, how do you get the pieces? How do you grind the nuts into pieces?
So usually for that, please. So usually for that, I will just have chefs chop it up by hand, so I can get like a pretty even. So if you're doing a much larger production, just put it in your Dynamix or your sorry, not your Dynamix, or in your RoboCoupe or your high-speed mixer, and just do a pulse chop until you get the size of about coconut size, so about 2 millimeters, and then you can just. I do 5%. I fold 5% of my mass. So if I have a kilo of peanut butter, I will add 5%, which is 50 grams of peanut pieces back in there and mix it in, and that gives me chunky peanut butter.
I'm sorry, you were breaking up. You said how much quantity versus the paste? How much pieces do you put versus like per kilo? Or like...
Right. So as I said, again, that's your choice. How chunky or how less chunky you want it. In my production, we do 5%.
5% of the pieces?
Of the pieces. So 50 grams of pieces for every kilo of paste.
50 grams per kilo. I see. Thank you.
Somebody is asking, are the plastic containers safe for nut butters? And also, what is the good temperature to keep the spread safe? Is there any do's and don'ts for storing the nut butters and nut paste?
It's the same thing that you would do for nuts, right? You don't want to keep them with a lot of light exposure, with a lot of heat exposure. You don't want to keep them too hot. You don't want to keep them in direct sunlight. If you're looking for the perfect temperature, 16 to 17 degrees Celsius at 45% humidity is the best temperature to store it. But that's just being that's if you have that ability. As long as you keep it at a cool room temperature without much light exposure, you should be fine.
So as far as sugar, that you discussed that earlier, we can use like any kind of sugar if we don't want to use, I'm sorry, for any recipe, we can use any kind of sugar that we decide to. And we can mix it with some of the like xylitol or sorbitol to just make it like less condensed.
Right, so xylitol is not a sugar. Xylitol is a sugar alcohol, which has different properties than sugar. You can, of course, use it. You won't get the same bulking possibility. So that's a whole different topic. I'm not going to go into xylitol for now. Sorbitol is a little more commonly used. All of these, of course, with all the sugar alcohols, you have to make sure that you're not using over 3 to 5% because they have laxative properties. So you're not using about, if you're using 100 grams of sugar, you make sure that only a small percentage of that is sugar alcohol. And if you're using, if you're going to do a sugar-free product where a lot of your sugar is sugar alcohols like xylitol or sorbitol or maltitol or maltodextrin or inulin, all of that, you have to make sure that you package it into much smaller containers, and you make sure that your plants are only eating, small portions at a time.
So can we skip the sweeteners and just use the regular sugar?
Yeah, you use regular sugar.
Just regular sugar instead of. Okay. I was going to
So I
ask,
think the only other sugars that I've used here are sorbitol and dextrose.
yeah,
And you can replace both. Yeah, you can replace both of those with sucrose, which is regular sugar.
but it won't affect the recipe because when you were explaining earlier, you said that you are dividing the between two just to make it, you know, the texture.
Slightly less sweet. No, not texture. It's the sweetness, the sweetening power.
Yeah, I see.
The dextrose is not as sweet as sugar, as table sugar. So it'll be slightly less sweet. If you use all sugar, it'll be slightly sweeter, which again, if you want to use all sugar and have it be slightly sweeter, it depends on what you want your recipe to be.
So roasting the nuts, you said some have more fat than others. So basically in your chart, you have the ones with high fat. Those with high fat, we should roast them less time or less temperature?
Less time.
Less time, okay.
Yeah, I would say 1/3 the time. So especially with walnuts and pistachios, even sometimes, I would just roast them for 10, 15 minutes. Take them out and taste.
I see.
Because they go very bitter very fast if you roast them too much.
Yes. And for any recipe or anything, we can email you. You can just help us with the recipes if we need any recipes.
Yes, yes. Yes, I am in that group of chefs that are very happy to share all of their recipes. So follow me on follow us on Instagram at Ether Chocolate. It'll give you a lot of inspiration, and if there's anything that you like and you would like the recipe for, you're welcome to email me.
Thank you.
The last question is also they're asking, when you fill the jars with the nut butters, what kind of sealing? Is there any special sealing methods? If there's
Right. So you can use a machine to seal it, but if you're doing it in an artisanal process, your jars will usually have a sealing cap on it, which you can use. You can use a jamming jar, which has a self-sealing, which has a heat sealing process. Or you can use one of these, where you could just heat up the top and then lock it and then turn it upside down, and that seals it for you. So I don't think I have any of the nut paste, but I have some of the fruit preserves that we make, and I'm going to show those to you so you can see the sort of sealing that we use. Just 1 second. Can you give me the blue and the blush as well, please? One blue, one blush. Oh, so actually, I just found, do you guys remember I was telling you about how we made peanut butter and chocolate with the caramel and we layered them together? So I just found that. So this is what that looks like. You see it has this beautiful layering to it. And it's got a layer of caramel spread and then a layer of the peanut Nutella on top. And it gives you this beautiful 2-layer spread. And then we made that custom for a client. And then we use the same sort of jar. So we do this with our pineapple spread right here. Of course, it doesn't have any nuts in it, but uses the same sort of sealing mechanism. I hope that helps. I'll have we use the same for our blue spread, which is the blueberry, blackberry, and balsamic. And then we do it with so this is one that I use rose petals in as well. So you'll see the rose petals floating around. And it's a lychee, rhubarb, and strawberry spread that we do with the same jarring mechanism.
So those are preserves, basically, jams?
Yeah, so these 3 are preserves, and then this is a nut spread that we made for a client. So it's got the caramel and the same recipe for Nutella as you have on your book, but we use peanuts instead of hazelnuts.
Chef, Can we also make marbled nut butter? Say, suppose if you want to mix two particular, maybe one chocolate and another plain nut butter, will like a marbling in a jar, like two flavors, just so that
Yeah.
I just don't know if there'll be a different kind of oil separation on two different kinds of nuts. So
No, you
once
can
there's a
fully do that. You can 100% do that. And I hear an Indian accent. Where are you from?
I'm from Bangalore.
Hello there.
Hi there.
Perfect. Yeah, no, reach out to me. I have some, some fantastic ideas on how to do layered spreads. So we do a bunch of layered spreads here as well.
Okay.
Especially coming into our new collection, we're exploring some more. One thing that we found just from a technical note with marbled or layered spreads is it's really fun and pretty to make them if you're making one or two, right? Because you're pouring two together.
Right.
That becomes really annoying when you're doing a production, when you're doing 40, 100, 200 spreads at a time.
Yeah.
So I would always recommend from a production point of view, instead of a marbled spread, I would recommend doing a layered spread, because then you can do all the first layer together and then the second layer together. You don't need as much manpower. Each one takes less time to do. If you're going to commit to doing a marbled spread, then it's just going to take a lot more manpower to do each spread.
Right. So when there is a oil separation of the spread and you go and stir the spread, especially when you're not using any of the emulsifiers. So if I were to do something without the emulsifiers and if I were to do a marbled spread, do you think it's a good idea or it's just a waste of time?
I don't think it's a waste of time. I think there's some concerns I would have with it. But I would say, I would keep that for your sort of Diwali gift box, or I would keep that I wouldn't put that on your production. I would put that for your, this is going to sell immediately. I'm going to use up all my 500 that I'm making, and I know that somebody's going to receive this for Diwali and eat it right away. Right? So when I know that it's going to be consumed pretty quickly, that's when I would use that recipe. And I would put it all over my Instagram that this is a recipe that we do. If you want to do it in your custom gift box, please tell us. Otherwise, I'm making a single spread.
All right. Thank you so much for your generosity.
Okay, it's like 12 o'clock. We are ending the webinar. We thank you all for participating. And we hope a lot of your questions are answered. And like we said in the beginning, we have recorded this session and we will share the link in a couple of days with all of you who registered. And also, Chef Prateek has been kind enough to share his recipes. So you will also get the email with the link and also the attachment. When you receive the emails, make sure it doesn't go into the junk and add us to your whitelisted email so you can get our emails. The other thing is we have some more webinars coming in the next 2 weeks. We have the webinar on process, equipment, and making chocolate with the different recipes. We have panelists from around the world, so stay tuned for more information on that. And thank you, Prateek, for your valuable time. I know you're so busy, and thank you for taking time and answering all the questions patiently. And thank you all the participants, because without you, this would not have happened. So I know all the people, you're all in different time zones, some of them closer to midnight. So thank you for staying with us and making this, great event. Thank you all.
Thank you everybody for
very
coming.
much. We appreciate that. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
And we want to thank our CocoaTown team, Teresa, Esther, and Raghavendra.
Thank you.
For making this possible.
Yeah, we thank CocoaTown. Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you.
Thanks indeed.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Thanks.
And thank you for staying.